For those coming back from the part one, I want to welcome you back. For those just joining us, this is part two of four parts for the 2019 Developers Q&A for the World of Sackfinia. If you haven't watched part one, I recommend you go back and watch that. Otherwise, let's go ahead and move forward with questions about the community from players. One of the questions that I get from time to time is are there any funny stories that I've had with my interaction with the community? And I have to say there are plenty of them. I used to go in the tavern a lot more than I do right now, but I still interact with players sometimes via mail or forum or other areas. However, I could tell you a lot of different enjoyable stories that I've had over the years. I'll focus on two primarily today, but I can say that it's definitely been a very pleasant experience overall interacting with the community. One of the funny stories that I have from Sackfinia's history is when I was trying to name the tavern wench or the barmaid, I asked the question, what should she be named? Well, one of the answers that I got was, I don't know. And I thought on that and I laughed. I said, you know what? That's a perfect name. So that is why our tavern has I Do Know, and she watches over it for us. Another story that I thought was funny is Ira, who used to play back in the early days, wanted to wear a bucket on her head. I don't remember why. It was just one of those funny little things that people do sometimes. And I went into the back of the database and forced the bucket essentially to be on her head. And so it was kind of like a long running little joke there. And I even coded on the back end that when buckets would break, the text would read kind of like what you're seeing there, your bucket broke. Even Ira would not wear that as a hat. So it was one of those funny things that was in there. Now, of course, as buckets got expanded and everything changed, that line kind of faded away. But that's one of those are two different stories that I always laughed at. Um, Now let's look at another question that came up. What past player behavior should come back? Now that's a bit of a loaded question because I do expect things to wax and wane over time based upon the players that are there and their interest. And I don't expect behavior to always be the same per se on that. You'll find some people are more into certain role plays and other people are more into trading and that kind of stuff. So there's a kind of ebb and flow with that. Of course, I would like to see five main things make a comeback in the future. One, form role plays. Things like balls, weddings, first meetings, battles, serenades, the kind of interesting stories because that's one thing that I used to always love taking the time out to do is reading people's role plays and reading these great little stories about what was going on essentially in the character's life. It was a nice kind of escape from reality. And number two, the restoration of political desire. A lot of times there's people who are in power for long periods of time, and it's more because they have to rather than they desire to. I'd love to see this kind of change and there be more of a political desire to be there, or even a little competition. Number three, I would love to see public in character discussions about towns, trades, etc. Maybe things about what makes a town unique, how they would trade, what they want to do with their people, that kind of stuff. Number four, I would love to see restoration of guilds and groups. I remember once upon a time reading and seeing some of the members of the Order of the Pillow, and I loved it. Their little religious group kind of deal was an interesting twist. We don't see that as much anymore. I'd love to see like even a trade guild or even maybe a legal society, which leads me to number five. I would love to see legal battles, discussions, trials, even maybe RP trials. Things where people look at the laws and say, hey, what should change? What's working? What isn't? Do we want to do something different? It's something that I think is always good to kind of shake things up. And then someone asked if beta testing was still a thing. Over the years, I've experimented with different ways of doing beta testing. A lot of version 3 was driven by it. Um, the biggest problem that I found is a number of our beta testers kind of fizzled out on giving feedback in a timely way, and sometimes were very difficult to get feedback on. I do appreciate all the work that the people who did contribute to it did. Uh, it's just one of those things where sometimes I wanted it to move a little bit quicker so I could get the feedback and adjust uh, as a response to it. That led the primary beta program that we had for version 3 fall to the wayside. Now, with that said, I'd love to do a beta testing again for different segments of the game or potentially for future versions. If someone is interested in beta testing, please let me know. And of course, we can look into it a little bit more in the future. Otherwise, essentially, all beta testing is done internally by myself. There may be times where I ask individuals to look at something, test it out, but as a general rule, it's mostly me or some member of the administrative team helping me out with it. Are there any ideas that I wanted to do but players didn't? That's an interesting question that someone brought to me. And over the course of the past decade, I've had plenty of ideas that have rolled through my head. Some of them have been more popular than others, or some of them too complex for the vision of what Sekfini is. Um, but there were a number of ideas that never quite made it into the game, such as line settings for battles, where you could have different setups of that, placements of the different groups and everything. Essentially, that got very negative reviews because players thought it would be too complicated. Um, Second idea was automatic taxation, and so instead of it having to be forcibly done, um, you'd be taxed, and it could be something done every week, every so many days. I really, really did want that in the system. We have such a great taxation system built into the code that's dynamic, where you could set how much you get taxed based upon levels, fields, workshops, and it's a great system that's almost never used. And I really wished it was. There's also a system for vice royalties to be able to essentially tax the towns as well, and that again isn't used very much either. That one's used a little bit more than the other one. It's something I wish there was more interest in, but there isn't, so we move on. The third area that I wanted to do was to have more diverse, flexible government roles. One of the ideas that I had was to have essentially the different jobs of government and be able to assign them to however many counselor roles there were, That could be dependent upon the actual vice royalty, which would have a lot more flexibility. So, like, for example, Bravia may have five counselors, and one of them has the roles of most of the finance minister and maybe public prosecutor role built into it as well. Or, it had different options on that. Your people's representative may have the judge responsibilities under them, but that just never quite panned out and wasn't very popular. In the end, though, games do tend to evolve by a balance of, ideas from the players, from me, my vision, the players' desires. So we take all that into consideration. And I think there's been tons and tons of improvements that's been added over the past decade, fueled by both. And I'm really happy with a lot of the code that's out there. And it's good to see the ideas that players have brought forth. But sometimes I wish I could put a few more of my ideas in. But like I said, it's a balance on that. Now, someone asked, how do we choose the community team? When we have openings, we usually post a notice publicly that we're looking for elders from our player base. This process has been something that's been streamlined over the years. When I first was looking for community team members and I was in charge of that primarily, Um, I handled all of it. Now it's been pushed more to our community manager. She's in charge of all of the trying to look for it and some of the different things with that. But each person who replies to that notice for wanting an elder is then evaluated upon several factors, including their activity in the game. Essentially, we want someone who's going to be relatively active. If they can't be active with their character, it's very likely that they wouldn't be active as a community team member. So we keep that in mind. Number two, we look at how they would handle a proposed moderation issue. Now, that can be from us giving them a situation and asking them how they would react, how they feel about that situation, and seeing their response. What's interesting is you can provide the same scenario to 12 different people, and sometimes you'll get 12 different views. So it's interesting to see their mindset, the way that they go through on trying to handle that. The main thing is, of course, making sure that they are following the rules. And as long as it's within that, there's a lot more leeway as far as how they would respond within reason. And then the third factor that is heavy in my mind is how they posted in the past in the forums. You're looking at whether they're diplomatic with other players. So, for example, let's say that they've had issues with another character. So, two characters are neck to neck. Can they interact as players without any issues? It's definitely one of those kind of things. Now, when we do get a candidate, every candidate is evaluated by the administrative team, and then we decide whether we want to go forward with adding them or not. And it's that kind of process on there. Now, another question that we get is, are there things that elders aren't allowed to do? There is a moderator code of conduct that they are required to follow. If you log into the game and go to moderation FAQ and scroll all the way down, this has the information about what their additional moderator code of conduct is. There are also certain restrictions that are hard coded into the game that prevent them from doing some actions in game. They're expected not to run for government positions, contribute towards political campaigns, and of course, they need to keep things separate from their regular character that they play. It's being able to keep that separateness that's a big factor in our consideration as well. Now, one of the other things that we require is confidentiality of any items that are discussed in the community team area. And part of the reason for that is people will bring up concerns about other players that we will discuss with our community team from time to time. And the issue may be a non issue that just needed to be communicated and passed along. But it's definitely something that you don't want necessarily broadcasted either. Uh, and so that are all the community questions that we had so far. The next video, part 3, will deal with developer questions. Hope to see you soon.